Did you know? The Nintendo Game Boy was the first video game console played in outer space. The system, loaded with a copy of the game Tetris, was played by Russian cosmonaut Alexander Serebrov. He sent the device back to Earth with a note attached saying, "Like all cosmonauts, I love sport. My particular favorites are football and swimming. During flight and rare moments of leisure, I enjoyed playing Game Boy." The console, game, and the note were sold in a charity auction for $1,220 in May 2011. Overall, Serebrov's Game Boy spent 196 days in space, orbiting the Earth over 3,000 times. The Nintendo Game Boy was released in 1989 and was designed by industry veteran Gunpei Yokoi. Yokoi began developing the device in 1986, but the origins of the console date back even further, all the way back to 1979. That year, on a train ride home, Yokoi witnessed a bored businessman playing with a pocket calculator, randomly pressing buttons to pass time. It was in that moment that Yokoi saw the utility of a handheld video game. At that time, Nintendo was predominantly a toy company and had only experimented in the video game market with their color TV game system. But Gunpei Yokoi had designed several successful toys for Nintendo, and his ideas held a lot of weight at the company. In 1980, Nintendo released Ball, the first title in Yokoi's Game & Watch series, and Nintendo's very first handheld video game. It used a custom printed LCD screen designed to show predefined characters and objects. Predefined art circumvented the need for dynamic displays using pixels. This saved on the amount of processing power the game needed and allowed for the handheld to be made using inexpensive components. Other handheld electronic games from that era were mostly card games or sports games, so the Game & Watch series was viewed as a creative new approach with broader appeal. Over the course of 11 years, 59 different Game & Watch titles were produced, selling over 43 million units worldwide. The multi-screen series of Game & Watch games even inspired the creation of the Nintendo DS. The 1982 port of Donkey Kong for Game & Watch was the first video game to feature the cross-shaped directional pad, or D-pad control scheme. The D-pad earned a Technology and Engineering Emmy Award, and was later patented by Nintendo. The Game Boy was called the DMG, or Dot Matrix game, in development circles. Even though more advanced technology was available, the Game Boy's hardware was chosen to be cost-efficient and use as little power as possible, just like the Game & Watch before it. The LCD screen of the Game Boy was given a blank green background because, in testing, green contrasted best with the LCD overlay in different levels of light. Yokoi has called his design philosophy lateral thinking of withered technology. Withered technology refers to technology that is older, cheaper, and well understood. And lateral thinking refers to using that old technology in new and innovative ways. The price point and battery life of the Game Boy helped give Nintendo an edge over more powerful handheld systems, like the Atari Lynx and the SEGA Game Gear, both of which came out around the same time as the Game Boy. The Game Boy also got a boost from its lineup of quality launch titles, including the Yokoi-designed Super Mario Land and a port of Tetris, which was at its height of popularity at the time. The Game Boy sold astonishingly well, but this wasn't the only time the Game Boy went to extremes. During the Gulf War, a Game Boy belonging to an American soldier withstood an explosion during a bombing raid. The unit suffered cosmetic damage, but it was operational. In fact, it still functions today and is on display at the Nintendo World Store in New York City. One of the most expensive handhelds ever produced was a Game Boy. Asprey Jewelers in London once sold a Game Boy for $29,500. It was plated in gold, had diamonds all around the screen, and weighed about 6 times more than a regular system. The Game Boy even crossed cultural boundaries despite government bans. After World War II, South Korea placed an embargo on imports from Japan. So in 1990, instead of Nintendo selling the device, Korean company Samsung did, renaming it the Mini Comboy. Samsung sold several Japanese consoles under alternate names during this time period, including the Genesis, NES, Master System, Game Gear, and Super Nintendo. In 1998, Nintendo released the Game Boy Camera and Game Boy Printer. The Game Boy Camera held the world record of being the smallest digital camera of its time. The camera wasn't just a novelty either. Singer-songwriter Neil Young released the album Silver and Gold in the year 2000. The album's cover photo was taken with the Game Boy Camera. The Game Boy Camera also had a few Easter eggs. If the player presses B during the credits sequence, a short video of Shigeru Miyamoto dancing will play. Nintendo also sold a special Zelda edition of the Game Boy camera through the Nintendo Power magazine. The cartridge was gold, and many of the graphics and clip art from the original were replaced with Zelda graphics. Another special edition of the Game Boy camera was never released. It was based around characters and images from the Japanese magazine Koro Koro Comics. Even though it was never released, much of the unique content from this version still exists in the ROM of the original Japanese Game Boy camera. Another Game Boy accessory was the Super Game Boy. Super Game Boy was an adapter for the Super Nintendo to play Game Boy games on the TV. What's interesting about the Super Game Boy is that the Super Nintendo did not have the ability to emulate Game Boy games. Instead, the cartridge itself contained most of the same hardware that was in an actual Game Boy, minus the screen and buttons. Perhaps the most unique system to come out of the Game Boy line was the infamous Virtual Boy. The Virtual Boy was one of the last products developed by Gunpei Yokoi, and had a 3D stereoscopic display that was comprised of arrays of red lines. These lines rapidly scanned across the field of vision using curved mirrors that moved back and forth. The system used red lines because blue and green LEDs were expensive and unreliable. The Virtual Boy had several prototypes. An early Virtual Boy model used a headset that was worn on the user's face as goggles. Another prototype, shown at the 1994 Consumer Electronics Show, featured a purple controller with multicolored buttons, reminiscent of a GameCube controller. The final design for the system was released in 1995 in Japan and North America, where it soon became an utter commercial failure. It was uncomfortable to play, and it caused some users to experience headaches and nausea. Nintendo had announced that over 100 games were in development for the system. At the end of the system's life, only 22 games had actually been released. Rumors emerged that Gunpei Yokoi was forced to leave Nintendo after being ostracized by the company for the failure of the system. These rumors were refuted in a publication called Yokoi Gunpei's House of Gaming. It was explained that Yokoi had been planning to leave Nintendo for a long time to start a company of his own. The Virtual Boy was intended as a parting gift before he left. It was an unlucky coincidence that the system was ill-fated. If he had gone ahead with his retirement at the time he planned, it would have looked like a public admission of defeat. So he actually stayed longer than he wanted at Nintendo, and he created the Game Boy Pocket as a concession. Yokoi soon retired and started his own company, Koto Laboratory, where he continued to consult with Nintendo. His last project was a Japan-only handheld system for Bandai called the Wonder Swan. Tragically, Gunpei Yokoi was struck and killed in a car accident in 1997 before the Wonder Swan was released. In 2003, Yokoi received a Lifetime Achievement Award by the International Game Developer Association for his countless contributions to the industry. The award was accepted by Yokoi's family on his behalf. Now, to explore even more about the Game Boy, let's dissect one in stop motion and see what facts are hidden inside. Come with me over to my channel Vsauce3 to find out, and, as always, thanks for watching.